Have you ever wondered, is language the greatest invention of human history? Or is language an intrinsic trait that humans possess, which differentiates us from other living organisms? Hi, I'm Telia,
I'm Joshua.
and welcome to our podcast, The Uncommon Senses, where we reflect on the nature of knowledge and on how we know what we claim to know.
From the dust, 143, one fell in the circle of the world like a flower buzz. A million marble mouths all blinking, moon of milky briar bloom sleeping.
Once again, welcome. In the following episodes, we'll start a brand new series on language as a way of knowing. And in this episode, we'll unpack the two fundamental theories of language acquisition by Skinner and Chomsky, which Skinner argues that language is acquired through nurturing, and Chomsky believed that language is a natural ability possessed by human beings. I'll first begin with a real-life event that happened in the 1980s. In a small village in Ukraine, SSR, there was a girl named Oksana Malaya. She was neglected by her parents at 3 years old and was raised by dogs. She was then found by her neighbors when she was 11 years old, and by the time she got rescued, she lost her ability to speak, and she behaved similar to a dog. She regained some ability to speak after she stayed in a mental health care home. However, her speech lacks any intonation, emotions, or rhythm. This illustrates that for a language acquisition, nurturing is arguably more important than a language's somewhat natural ability to communicate. And this brings us to Skinner's language theory, which relies heavily on human nurturing. The first language acquisition theory is a behaviorist theory by American psychologist B.F. Skinner in 1957. Behaviorism basically refers to human actions that are a result of conditioning. And there are two main types of conditioning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning, where classical conditioning involves associating an involuntary response and a stimulus, while operant conditioning is about associating involuntary behavior and a consequence. So, for classical conditioning, a famous example is Pavlov's dog, which the dog salivates as a natural response when food is served alongside with a ringing bell sound. Eventually, the sound of the bell will trigger its involuntary natural response of salivating, even when food isn't served. And for operant conditioning, it's associated with a reward. For example, when you train your dog to do a trick and you give it a snack immediately after they did the trick, they will associate the trick with the snack, which is the reward. So now, going back to Skinner's language theory, he argued that children learn language through operant conditioning, which basically means like children learn to say words like hungry or thirsty when they want to have a food or have a drink, because over time they'll realize that whenever they say these words, their parents will provide them with the food or drinks, which will reinforce their use of these words for them to get the reward and what they want. Therefore, parenting plays a huge role when it comes to language acquisition for Skinner's theory. So far we've talked about Skinner's language theory. So Joshua, to what extent do you think Skinner's idea applies? For example, in Skinner's theory, it seems like the use of words are kind of functional. Like, you are hungry, like this is like a natural need and you want to eat. And then you feel thirsty, you need water, which are natural needs for human beings, which, all of these are relating to a reward, and language is used to acquire and fulfill our needs. However, can Skinner's theory apply when language isn't purely functional? Like, are there any instances where you don't get a reward for saying certain words? So yeah, what's your opinion on Skinner's theory?
Well, I think in terms of Skinner's theory, I think this relates to linguistic dualism, in which it states that language has two layers. So language serves two different purposes. On one hand, language can represent tangible objects such as rock, sky, house, etc. And I guess these are they have the rewards in it of itself, because when you talk about these objects, it allows us to create effective communication effectively. When I said rock, you immediately know what I mean, and this conjure up a image, or it conjures or you know what I'm precisely referring to. However, when I say well, language refers to something that's intangible, such as beliefs, customs, or traditions, some things that are very subjected to change or subjected to context, or something that's referring back to like social constructs. I think
Mm.
um, in this sense, language kind of doesn't really serve a very
Mm.
functional purpose, or it doesn't really provide us with a reward, because um as seen, the person receiving the message does not always know what I'm referring to. So in this sense, language becomes less effective, and hence I think poses a problem in terms of communication. Hence, it's not always functional, or that it always provides a reward.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. I think there's so many instances, like as we grow up and then we use language, there's so many times where it's not functional at all. Like I'm not communicating to a person for a specific reward, but then like I'm more or less expressing myself, I guess. In a lot of instances, that's where language is used. And yeah, I guess and at the early stage of like language development, like when we say our first word like mama or papa, whatever, I can arguably that's quite functional, right? Like you are asking your like parents, your providers for resources, like you are hungry, well, you want them to give you food and then stuff. So I would say, I mean, I do believe that there are languages used for functional use, but then I feel like Skinner's idea is a little bit like just it's a very narrow perspective when it only limits language acquisition in terms of like a functional purpose
Yeah.
only.
Actually, I'm also interested because, what are your thoughts on profanities? So, when sometimes perhaps you stub your toe, or you um look at something that's really frustrating, sometimes you may, let out some cuss word
Mm-hmm.
or a curse word. And some people argue that these does not really serve a function, because you're just, you're cursing the air, you're not really doing anything. While some others would argue that it is a form of, relief. You're trying to vent
Mm.
out your frustration, you vent out your anger. So what are your thoughts on it? Do you think, are profanities functional or not?
I mean, I can see it when I can see when profanities can be functional because like I remember like we were talking about this at some point in the class, like swearing is somewhat good because it helps you to relieve like your anger, like what you said, like you vent out your emotions. So like I guess since humans like we're social animals and like we have this desire to express ourselves, so I guess that is good, right? Like you don't want to bottle up everything.
So yeah, exactly. And I think this is also kind of reveals one of the flaws of Skinner's theory, is that the meaning of functionality is really
Mm.
wide. So um you can always assign different functions to different, languages. For example, like you can say that, oh, profanity has the function of relieving stress or trying to vent out the frustration. But as you said, these functionalities can be assigned by people. It doesn't really,
Mm.
perhaps in and of itself, it does not really serve a function on its own. So I guess the ambiguity surrounding Skinner's claims that, all language must serve a function could
Mm.
doesn't really it could be argued that it doesn't really mean, or say anything, because functionality can be assigned by people manually instead of the thing being functional on its own.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think in terms of what Skinner argued that nurturing is important, I think in later on in our conversation we're gonna reach to that point. But the whole thing about his argument that we learn language through conditioning, through saying words because there's a reward, I think somehow I do think that idea is flawed in some ways. So let's move on to the next language theory by Noam Chomsky, who is a famous linguist, and he was skeptical towards Skinner's behaviorist theory. And Chomsky proposed this theory of universal grammar and published his paper in 1965, which argued that babies have the innate ability to learn languages without any formal instructions. He is regarded as the father of modern linguistics, and Chomsky's idea has been widely accepted and prompted many research by other scholars. So from the TED video in 2011, which I'll link it in the description, the Linguistic Genius of Babies by Patricia Cull, she presents a graph that is agreed by most scientists, which showed that our ability to learn a new language would decrease from the age of 7. So from decades of research, it seems like Chomsky's language theory is true. For a neurotypical human, we were all programmed to learn languages from a young age. It is nature that we crave for communication with the outside world. However, when does nurturing play a significant role in our language communication? So I was wondering about this as I remembered myself learning foreign languages on Duolingo, and there's no way I could roll my R's in Italian. Surely at some point, the environment we live in and the language spoken by our parents will play into our language acquisition. So from the same TED video I mentioned before, The Linguistic Genius of Babies, Patricia found that American babies and Japanese babies both respond to the English R and L sound, which are pronunciations that are important in the English language but not in the Japanese language, similarly at 6 to 8 months old. However, at 10 to 12 months old, the American babies respond to the R and L sound way better than the Japanese babies. So after 2 months, so from 8 to 10 months old babies, we can see just how much nurturing can play a significant role in language acquisition. But what about bilingual babies? What if the baby was raised in both an English and Japanese speaking environment? In theory, from what we traditionally believed about learning, which argued that we should always focus on one thing at once, and learning 2 languages together may impact the overall outcome. However, recent studies found that being bilingual could strengthen our brain and enhance our ability to problem solve, switch tasks, and focus and filter irrelevant information. Patricia also realized that the physical presence of a human being in communication is important for babies who are being exposed to a second language at 10 to 12 months old, by comparing the results of exposing the babies to audios only and videos only of a foreign language. It is the social interaction that facilitates our natural ability of language acquisition. So, Joshua, as someone who has grown up in a bilingual environment, what do you think about, what I mentioned about like the studies showing that bilingual brain can help us problem solve better, switch tasks better, focus better, filter irrelevant information better? Because for me, I technically didn't grow up in a bilingual environment. It was mainly Mandarin, and then there are some English, but I think the amount of English is definitely less than yours. However, sometimes my brain just got jammed. There are times I can't switch between the 2 languages. I think we are definitely going to talk about bilingualism in the future episodes, but what do you think about the research result? What's your first-hand experience growing up bilingual?
I guess it's kind of there's both, the good side and also the bad side, and I think I felt the full blunt of it. So in terms of the advantages of growing in a bilingual environment, I think that it allows us to, think differently and in the perspectives of different cultures. So, for example, I would say that in Chinese language, I think um the words we kind of use tends to be more indirect, so there's a lot more emphasis on being polite and being able to restrain our emotions in the words we speak. But I think as opposed to English, I think a lot of the times uh, I think the words we use it tends to reveal emotions more readily. So um I guess it also relates to the different cultures. So because in our business class we learned about how Western culture is a low context culture and Chinese culture is a high context culture, and it, what it essentially means is that in Chinese culture we tend to be more restrained and we tend to use polite words, I guess,
Right.
yeah, and then in English they tend to be more direct when speaking their feelings, and I guess that being able to grow up in both environments allow me to kind of see that to use language differently according to context. So sometimes I'll be able to use Chinese to in perhaps more formal situations where emotions is not needed as much, or I would use English in perhaps more casual environments where I'm able to freely express my feelings.
Right.
But in terms of the disadvantages of growing up in a bilingual environment, I think that you know the phrase where it's like jack of all trades, master of none.
Oh,
I think, trying to keep up, learning both languages is a pretty hard task because I find out that the more I use one language, for example, Chinese, the worse I'm getting in the other
mm,
language, such as
yes.
English. So I guess, yeah, so sometimes, it's kind of like take or give.
Mm,
You have to choose what language you want to practice more and sacrifice your ability in the other language. And it's not always an easy choice. And I think it's also very interesting, Hong Kong as an environment, growing up in Hong Kong as language learning environment, because in Hong
mm,
Kong we often use Chinglish, which is a
mm,
combination of Cantonese and English. And I find it very interesting in, like, perhaps in places where there are colonial footprints, or
mm.
in places where different cultures clashes together, it tends to create a new language where it encompasses both the traits of one language and another. So
Yeah.
I guess this is also reflected in English. We did an essay on is English a mongrel
Mm,
language in
yeah.
primary, and it, when you look at English as a language itself, you actually see a lot of the traits, perhaps from Latin, from French origin, from Spanish
Mm,
origin. You see, it acquires different characteristics of different languages. So, I guess but I digress. But I guess circling back to your question, I think, I would definitely say that growing up in a bilingual environment is a good thing, but it's not always it's not always positive. Sometimes
mm,
I don't think one could fully be able to master two languages at the same time, because it's quite, language itself is quite a lot of stuff to learn. So
yeah.
I do think that sometimes, even for people living in a bilingual environment, it's kind of like a unilingual environment, because
Mm.
you kind of have to you kind of have to choose one language over the other.
Oh yeah, there's so many good points in what you just mentioned about, and I absolutely agree with the fact that your ability of one language just regresses when you didn't use it for a long time. Even though, I mean, I guess the argument a lot of like research papers found is that learning two at the same time is better. But then like what you mentioned, like the jack of all trades one, like traditionally we kind of always believe that you should learn one thing at one time, and then when you have two things together, for sure one of them is going to like become worse, or like you're not going to be as good as when you're learning two things together. However, like even though research found that sometimes learning two things together is like also works, but then I guess for me personally and for us, like I don't think that this applies to me specifically. Like it's always about like using the language, I guess, in communication. So I think another thing about living in a bilingual environment, I think it's also strange that there are people that know how to speak Chinese and English, and then eventually their English is going to be much better at the Chinese, and then because Chinese is somewhat more difficult, and then they're not going to speak Chinese as much. Yeah, I guess there's also like this kind of language, one being easier to learn, one being harder to learn situation. I mean, before I was speaking a lot of Mandarin in primary school, but then after I come here, like especially in recent years, I'm starting to speak way more English, and I'm more confident at my English than my Chinese. And it's kind of like I'm using English more, and also I think English is definitely much more easier than Chinese. So yeah, I guess there's also that difficulty in language, and I guess it really depends, and it's somewhat subjective, even though I guess it all showed like we are going to become better at English if you're living in an environment that speaks both Mandarin and Chinese and English. And also, it's very interesting you brought up the point about like language in general, like how English is a mongrel language, and there's like Chinglish, and there's you know different specific words that are derived from other languages, like a translation from the other language. Like sido is like store, and I think there's a lot of countries and regions that their whole language system is multilingual, bilingual, like Malaysia, right? Like they speak so many languages. I think it's just very interesting to see how countries around the world are dealing with multilingualism. And yeah, I just think it's really interesting that at the end there's so much like cultural exchange with our language as well.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. And I think it reminds me of, even the difference between, verbal language like 方言. So like
Mm,
there's a difference between Mandarin and Cantonese, even though
yeah.
they technically belong into the same, linguistic
Mm,
branch of
yeah.
Chinese. And I think a lot of the words that we kind of use differently as well, such as
Mm,
I think, do you guys say like 方便面, like
yes.
for instant noodle? But then we say
Mm,
we say 即食麵, and then like there's a lot of examples we learn like primaries, like
yeah.
腳踏車, like 腳踏車,
Right.
and also like 單車.
Yeah.
Yeah,
自行车, yeah.
yeah. So sorry for
Yeah.
our English speaking audience. It's probably very confusing, but yeah, it's just, these are just some examples of how can even verbal language can change a lot, maybe even arguably more than written language, since
Mm,
it oh, dialects, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry,
dialect.
my brain kind of froze there. Yeah, dialects can change according to different perhaps geographical location or culture, and it remains really volatile, even perhaps even more so than written language. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a very interesting point to note.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about dialects in China is kind of like I guess the concept is like dialects in China can be very, very different. Like, I have no idea what Cantonese means growing up in a Mandarin environment. So, yeah, I think languages and dialects, like what we just previously discussed about like bilingualism, multilingualism, is definitely interesting. And however, just now, like from what I previously mentioned, that Patricia's research that it is important for babies to learn languages through social interaction and communication. However, both of us are introverts, and as introverts, like Joshua, what's your view on this idea that social interaction is important in communication? I guess perhaps universally it is important for babies, but then as we grow up, I feel like it's, for me at least, it's becoming less important. There are other methods which I communicate my ideas through, such as writing or like this podcast, or as technology advances, maybe through text messages, emails. So how do you think that has changed for you? Like as introverts, what's your view on this social interaction and its relationship and its significance for human communication?
Yes, I think when people think about social interaction, they think about the more direct way of communicating. So through perhaps talking, or in social conventions. So it's more about verbal interaction. But I guess as introverts, we kind of prefer more indirect forms of communication, such as you've mentioned, like painting, or like
Mm,
perhaps using technology as a way of to mediate that kind of awkwardness in
yeah.
interacting with people, or that anxiety to meet new people. So yeah, I think as introverts, it's more, we just, it's not that we don't interact with other people. I think it's just that we tend to use a more indirect way, because
Mm,
I guess we're more prone to anxiety when, you know, in the when communicating directly
mm,
with other people. And what this argument reminds me of is that it reminds me of the debate of how some people would prefer texting over actual
mm,
interactions, because texting allows you to have that lead time to think about your response and to kind of
right.
construct perhaps a certain impression when you are communicating with other people, versus when you're interacting in real time, you would have to think about the response quickly, and you wouldn't really have time to create you don't really have time to think about other things other than the message that you want to convey. And also, and when you're texting, perhaps there's this kind of I guess like a safe space
Mm,
for you to kind of um, rethink your message, or like delete some typos or something that you don't want to say or that you accidentally
yeah.
said. Versus when you're interacting in real time, it's very hard to get back something that has already been spoken. So yeah, I guess
Mm,
you know, at least from as an introvert, from my point of view, there seems to be more advantages in communicating indirectly
mm,
over than communicating directly. Although I don't know, with quarantine, it kind of changed my
yeah.
view on things, because it made me realize that sometimes when talking with friends through Zoom or talking with friends through
Mm,
technology, there is this kind of just I don't know, it just feels different because
mm,
without the actual interaction, and with sometimes technology does fail us perhaps in terms of lagging, and also obstructions to our way of
mm,
communication. So
yeah.
I guess it made me realize that fully communicating indirectly also has its faults. And now I think that I'll give both, like, direct and indirect communication a 50-50, because
Mm.
I feel like they both have its advantages, disadvantages, and it really depends on how you use it and when you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as introverts, the thing that I want the most is that time lag, between communication, so I can have my time to like form my thoughts and then say it to other people. And I do agree with the thing about the pandemic. I think I definitely crave more for like a physical interaction because I've been lacking that. But also I'm scared to have that, like you've been yourself the whole time and you go out with like so many people around you and you're like shocked, like, oh my God, what is this? Yeah, like I think it's interesting what the pandemic did to us with like online learning because Patricia's research kind of showed that babies don't really learn that well when there's just like a video, like a webcam person teaching them a language. Like they don't really respond very well to a certain a foreign language by learning through that particular method. And I guess that speaks a lot for like online learning as well, like Duolingo, like what I previously mentioned. I was trying to learn Italian on it, but it's so hard for you to actually do that because there's no actual human being talking to me, and there's just a very mechanical way. And yeah, there's also research that found that if you learn a foreign language at a very young age, then you're able to communicate the emotional aspects. But then if you learn it at a much older age and you are only going to use like your words are going to be very functional. And I guess that's very similar to the first example that I raised about Oksana Malaya, the girl who was raised by dogs in Ukraine SSR. Like when she grew up and learned some languages, she's only able to communicate very basic meanings. So yeah, I think that social interaction as an introvert, it's important, but it's just a different thing that I crave for. And I feel like as introverts, and I'm an INFP, there's a lot of safety that I need. Like I know psychological safety. Like I know when I say something, like I won't be judged. I think that's the first thing. So yeah, that's something like I feel like as an introvert I don't really like about physical interaction, because I'm able to pick up like everyone's micro emotions and like micro expressions and like what they think about what I just said. So that's something I really do not like. But then I also don't like when people like Zoom meet and then close all of their webcams, and I don't know what their reaction is to what I say. So yeah, I guess as INFP, it's not that I don't want to say something, but if I get the psychological safety, I got a lot of things to say, but I just don't know how to say it. But yeah, there's a lot of things going on in my brain that I want to say it out. So I guess that's very interesting for us introverts to talk about social interaction. And also the thing is, like people always tell like introverts to speak up, but then they never tell extroverts to shut up. And I guess that's also like something fundamental thing about, just human beings are social animals in general. Like, I guess fundamentally we're expected to be extroverts, we're expected to socialize. And yeah, I also read something like about the MBTI, like the 16 personality test, and that INFPs are kind of sad because the society are expecting like humans become ESTJ, which are complete opposites of INFP. And I kind of feel like that's true to some extent. I can link that video in the description, and I think it's a pretty good discussion about 16 personality test. And I think in future episodes we're also going to talk about the 16 personality test, because over the years there has been a lot of attention given to this particular popular test, and like also a lot of questions regarding like, is this a credible source, like is this accurate, should I trust it, is it just like a new form of astrology among young people now, all of that kind of discussion. So we're going to definitely talk about this in the next few episodes. So I guess the last question is about this thing about the sense of language, 语感. I suddenly thought about this because I remember in English class, like we write essays, we get judged for our grammar, and our English teacher's comment to us was, you are using the wrong prepositions in English. And the reason is like it's something that cannot really be taught, right? Like you can't really learn like prepositions, because it's more about like how your sense of language. And since our mother tongue are not really English, like we grow up in a Cantonese or Mandarin environment, which doesn't even have the idea of prepositions. So yeah, Joshua, what do you feel about this very vague concept, like the sense of language, or like when using certain grammatical concepts that are not really used in your own language but exist in other languages? Like, how do you learn that, and how do you acquire that kind of knowledge?
Yes, I think 语感, or like as you've mentioned, like prepositions in a sense of language is very important when you're trying to acquire a new language, mainly because I think language is not something that you can learn according to rules or because there's just so many exceptions. So an example I can think of is Mark Twain's 1880 essay, The Awful German Language, of which he commented humorously on the difficulties of learning a new language and how new learners can be easily frustrated by the many exceptions to rules of different language. And I think that's simply because at its core, language lacks consistency, simplicity, and clarity. So for example, writers can make up words that are not found in dictionaries, or they can use slangs that are spoken verbally but not necessarily written. And there are just many examples of how words can be phrased differently, or sentences can be rearranged. And I think without this sense of language, it will be very hard for new learners to kind of maneuver or try to speak fluently in a language, because there's a difference between learning a language by textbook. So like, in English, we learn that when we greet someone, we have to say, oh, how are you feeling? And you have to respond, I'm fine, thank you. But as we've known through experience and empirical knowledge, that this may not always be the case, because if we always follow the textbook way of learning a language, then our communication is going to be very rigid, and it's going to sound really forced. So I guess from understanding the sense of language, to understand the sense of language, I guess the biggest way of doing so is through just exercise and constant practice, and trying to speak more of that language to kind of gain the spirit of the language, instead of just understanding its rules, which can change all the time.
Yeah, oh gosh, yeah, talking about the rules of language, I think there's so many things that we can potentially discuss, and we will possibly discuss that in the next few episodes. And yeah, I remember in class I also mentioned about like computer science languages. Is that counted as a new form of language in the 20th and 21st century, as it has become way more significant? AIs are creating languages and all of that. And yeah, so I do remember the Mark Twain thing about the awful German language. And I mean, honestly, the irony is that when he was writing that, it was awful. Like, he was commenting like how German was awful, but then he wrote it in English, and then it was awful too, like the way he phrased certain things. So like, do computer languages offer more rigid rules that we can follow, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? We'll definitely talk about that in future episodes. And I think we are also going to talk about, I think, how language is used to create our reality. It's kind of like the argument, like, do thoughts come first or do language come first? Yeah, I guess these are the few things that we will potentially discuss in the future episodes. And thank you so much for listening to our podcast today, and we'll see you next time on The Uncommon Senses.